Well, for a more in-depth look at how the upcoming EU referendum is impacting Britain's business community, I spoke to Jacob Kirkegaard. He's a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics.
Well, because fundamentally, businesses do not like, and particularly banks, do not like uncertainty. And we now have a situation that no one really knows what the alternative is. If Britain leaves, no one knows what's going to happen. And that situation is actually quite deliberately created, because David Cameron and the other European countries, they don't want there to be a plan B, you know, that you can just sort of pick out from the drawer and then there it is. They want uncertainty because they know that if a few weeks before the actual poll, votes are being cast, that there is uncertainty about what the result will be, financial markets will respond, and they will almost certainly respond very negatively.
So they're hoping that this fear will be enough to just kind of stop people from even thinking about the alternative. Let me put it this way, that is their plan B. That is their sort of last line of defense. They would, of course, prefer to go into the last couple of weeks of the election or the referendum campaign with a 20% lead in the polls. And that's what businesses would like too, because they don't want to go through a period of acute financial market volatility to get to a yes. And that's why they're speaking up now. You have the UK, the world's 5th largest economy, and several multinational firms who have their base in London. So in terms of the issues that they could face if there was a Brexit, what does that mean in terms of their ability to do business within the EU?
Well, the short answer, we don't know, but I can certainly say that the chances to do business throughout the EU from the UK in an exit will be materially worse. In fact, they could be very, very dramatically worse. And therefore, businesses that have invested, particularly from around the world, that have invested in the UK as a platform to service the entire European market, they're going to find themselves in a bind.
Now, are there any businesses that could perhaps benefit from a Brexit? There's a lot of this doom and gloom and loss of jobs for people who want to stay in the EU. Does anyone benefit if they leave in terms of these businesses?
Well, I mean, it's clear that if you anytime you have a sort of event happen that reduces cross-border trade, which, in my opinion, there's no doubt that Brexit would lead to. There are those typically small and medium-sized firms in the UK that perhaps are competing with, you know, imports from France and elsewhere, and they, you know, you might say that they had a benefit. I personally believe that that benefit will be small, and for the economy as a whole, it will pale compared to the negative side. But no, I mean, there are winners even from this bad outcome.
Now, how will multinationals handle this? We've talked about the smaller companies. What do? Do they just move operations, or like how would they proceed?
I think many of them will. Will they completely abandon, the City of London if you're a financial services firm? No. But will they continue to expand their presence in London rather than, for instance, expand more in other potential European financial centers, in Paris, or Frankfurt, or elsewhere? No, I think that's what's going to happen. Similarly, if you are a car producer, are you going to continue to expand your production facilities in the UK, or are you going to expand elsewhere in Europe? I think it's clearly the latter.
Are businesses concerned that if the UK does decide to leave the EU, that other countries then may pop up and want to renegotiate their situation and make life very difficult to do business in the European Union?
No, I think that risk is certainly there for businesses, being sort of a more fragmented marketplace and the sort of end of the European internal market. But I think when we think that scenario through, that risk is actually much more a broader political risk than it is a financial risk, because what we're talking about here is fundamentally the unraveling of the European Union, which, when we recall that the European Union was put in place to avoid a lot of nasty things in the early 20th century, the political risk of this process are far, far worse than the economic ones. But from the perspective of businesses, they, of course, worry about market fragmentation.
And just lastly, one of the main issues that had a lot of concerns for British voters was the migrant crisis. How do you see that playing out in terms of what this means for the voters?
Well, I think basically that the only way in which the out campaign can win is if they manage to convince British voters that really what this vote is about is not about Brexit or not, it's about yes or no to migration. That if they can convince British voters that if they say we want to leave, that migration then ends, then they might, in fact, succeed. Now, of course, in my opinion, that's fantasy. And especially for the UK, where it's sort of ironic that those who actually are guarding the British borders are not British police right now. It's the French.
Right, in Calais.
In Calais and elsewhere, which, of course, the French are likely to stop doing in that scenario. And in fact, if you wanted to be a little bit sinister, I would, in fact, be willing to bet that, again, if the polls are close a couple of weeks before the vote, that maybe the French authorities just decide, you know, we're going to send home our border guards for the weekend and then see what happens. But basically, the bottom line is that no, migration is a very important issue for this vote. And in my opinion, as I said, it holds the potential key, the only key for a no vote. So no, it's a big, big deal.